Well, we're pleased to have you join us for another episode of Curiosity, Not Judgment. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
So, this morning I got into some really robust, healthy, I think, conversation around the topic of grief. And it made me really introspective about how I handle certain things. And I was also thinking about how, when I have been in periods of grief, how other people have responded to me. And I thought this was something that we probably should give a little time to and ask some curious questions around.
Yeah, that's a good one. There's a lot of grief going around many things, and so that's a it's a great timely topic.
Yeah, I think so. I think what I was really questioning for myself today was, what is my response in the light of someone else's grief? And I know enough about myself to know that I'm very much a fixer. I want to fix problems. And so if somebody expresses to me grief, I want to find a way to help them get out of grief. But what I'm coming to understand is that kind of that American ideology of toughen up, get over it, get on with life, buck up. I think I already said that, but just that concept is really not healthy, and it's not something that is universal. I think is inherent to Americans, and maybe it's something about our sense of we need to be productive at all times. We need to have what we're doing benefit ourselves or benefit our community. And so grieving is really for the individual. Other nations grieve in very different ways. And I'm even thinking about cultures that have very specific parameters around grief and mourning, and even maybe invoking other people to come into the grieving mourning process. And so just wanted to pause a moment and get your reflections on it, Gary, and just any immediate thoughts you had.
Yeah, no, I've been exposed to the Jewish tradition of grief, and they've got very different stages. They've got immediate grief, grief for the first 7 days, grief for the first 30 days, grief for the first year, anniversaries of griefs, memorials, and they have really good traditions, and people will come and do things like you
Mm,
said, there's prescribed ways where people can come and grieve with you, where you sit Shiva with somebody. And I may not be saying that right. I apologize to anybody who has a better pronunciation of that, but and you do things together. And I've been watching The West Wing lately, and the chief of staff says to his assistant at one point, he tells him a story. He says, one day this guy goes down the street and he falls in a hole, and a doctor comes by, and the doctor sees him down. He says, "Hey, doc, can you help me out?" And the doctor writes out a prescription, throws it down in the hole. Um, and then a minister comes by, and he says, "Hey, can you help me?" And the minister writes out a prayer and throws it down in the hole. Well, then a friend of his comes by, and he goes, "Hey, Joe, I'm down here in this hole." And then Joe jumps down there with him.
mm,
And the friend looks at him and says, "What are you doing, dummy? Now we're both down here." He goes, "Yeah, but I've been in this hole before and I know how to get out."
mm,
And so he says, I'm going to jump down in this hole with you. So, the I really like that, because it's not, I'm going to be prescriptive. I'm going to fix it, like what you're saying, as we as Americans like to do. And
yeah,
grief often makes us uncomfortable because it's like, okay, when can we move on? It's not my grief. Why do I need to do this with you? I'll try to help you out of it, but hey, keep it to yourself. Very unhealthy. And if you think about it, and as I'm saying it out loud, and that story, I'm just going to be there with you,
yeah,
right? And I think that, and sometimes that's all it takes. You don't
mm,
have to do anything. You don't have to fix it. You don't have to just, I'm here,
yeah,
and what's the curious questions around grief?
mm,
My own grief and other people's grief.
yeah. Well, for me, I think the first one that comes to mind is, have I allowed myself to grieve? Whatever the
Mm,
circumstance is have I taken the time to really process this and to let, if grief is going to wash over you, so to speak, in an emotional way, have I allowed that space to get that kind of work, quote unquote, done?
And have you allowed yourself to go through the psychological stages of
Yeah.
grief?
Yes.
And I think people identify with those stages of grief because we've all been through it in some way. It's not necessarily the loss of a loved one, it is, or the death of someone. It can be the grief of any loss of
Mhm.
anything.
Yes.
There's been a lot of this was election week, so there's a lot of people going through grief right now.
Yes.
And the stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I think, and I hope, and I don't know any different in my experience, those stages were written down as experience, not as somebody kind of thinking up what you should do.
Right.
Because I think we all kind of go through those. Now, sometimes we give short shrift to some of them, or we try to hurry through them, or whatever. But I know when I lost my late wife, it was there was a grieving process, right? And it was difficult. And even if I knew what they were, I didn't necessarily want to go through them, and I certainly didn't know how to ask for help to go through them.
Yeah.
And I didn't, and I'm kind of one of those people that I just want everybody to get along in my life and nobody feels uncomfortable. So I didn't want to ask anybody, to do it with me. So when you say, do we process grief properly? I know I don't.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that speaks to probably a second really important question is if you've got someone close to you that is going through grief, what does it look like to grieve alongside them?
Mhm,
And I don't think there is a prescription answer on this, maybe aside from first off, just show up. And
mhm,
I have heard a lot of varying opinions on, do you offer to bring food? Do you offer to go to the grocery store? Do you offer to clean up their house? And, I've heard some people say the questions are so frustrating to the individual going through grief because they're overwhelmed and can't think of yet another thing to produce an answer for. And so I know that there's very good intentions for those, that we love that want to step in and be helpful in some capacity. But when you're already feeling that sense of complete overwhelm, even having to navigate the question of can I bring you dinner may be too much. And so that's why I say this is not a prescriptive, answer in the sense of I think it's going to be very individual. And as you know, people in your life, it may be you show up with something, you leave it at this doorstep and you just send them a text, hey, just so you know, there's a bag of food, on the porch. And so there's no decision that has to be made, or for others, they may be very they need a distraction, right? Like, hey, can we go grab a bite to eat together? I think might be beneficial for you to get out of your house for a little bit. It's going to look wildly different depending on the personalities.
totally. And bring a casserole is a very typical American response, right?
Sure.
And I can tell you that I had a lot of casseroles in my freezer for a while, and there may still be some in there. But some of it is the thought that counts. Some of it is you have to let people grieve the way they want to grieve.
Yes.
Um, and you're right, it is kind of overwhelming when you're in it, and sometimes you don't even know what you need.
Yes.
My dad, I'll never forget, a couple weeks after my late wife passed away, he came over and he said, and he had gone through that too with my mother. And he came and sat down and he just looked at me, he goes, so how are you? And I said, I don't know, I'm okay, I guess. And he goes, let me tell you something. You're not a good judge of that right now.
Mhm.
You're not a good judge of how you're doing. And,
Yeah.
and he says, from my experience, I was not a good judge of how I was doing.
Yeah.
I could not make a proper assessment even of how I'm doing at the time. And it was true for
Mhm.
me at the time. It really resonated. It was very helpful to me because it almost gave me permission that I don't have to know how I'm doing right now. Because part of the problem, and when I went through a cancer diagnosis, it was a very similar thing. It was like, I'm not sure how to process this. So you're asking me how to help me process. I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because I think that probably is the third curious question for me is about the duration of grief, and are we allowing ourselves the time to walk through the various emotional states when there's not going to be a quick resolution. You know, when somebody passes away, it is a moment in time and you're not waiting for milestones, right? But when you have a diagnosis, there are definitely milestones involved. And so we had this conversation, and even on this platform, you know, what was it, last summer after my diagnosis, when people wanted to help, they wanted to come alongside, but they also wanted to hurry up and be done with the bad news. And so I really struggled through that and finding myself irritated and agitated around people that wanted to just close the book on it. It's like, oh, great, your surgeries are done, you're healed, right? It's like, yeah, but I've got 4 more years of PET scans and I've got all of these other things. And so that notion of people kind of just being tired of bad news and not wanting to be with you in the long haul of what that grief over time might need to look like because of various stages was a frustration to me, and probably still is to some degree.
Hmm. And and it is my observation and my experience that the people that I know anyway, the people that I think were trying to help me and gave me that same sense that you got, which is people were okay for a little bit, but not very long.
Yeah.
I think we kind of walk around, and this is a generalization, but we kind of all walk around right here. And here's overwhelmed, here's too much stress, here's I can't handle it anymore.
Yeah.
And we're just right under it. And we do whatever necessary to kind of cope and stay here,
Hmm.
instead of maybe working on it and giving ourselves a little margin.
Yeah.
We're always kind of right here. And so I'm sorry, Birga, but you've put me over,
Yeah.
and there's only so long I can do that. And I need to get back
Yeah.
to where I hang out.
Sure.
And I think that may be a condition, a human condition, of a lot of us in the States right now.
Yeah. Well, yeah, in the States, I think that that phrase might be really true and really impactful in how we think about this, because I don't know. I mean, I have no experience living in another country. I have no, aside from hearing stories about how grieving and mourning works in other places, I have no firsthand knowledge. But I find myself wondering, what does long-term support through diagnosis look like in other places? Is there that quickness to want to be done with it? Is there that kind of urgency to close that chapter? And I wonder, just is that an American thing? Is that a global thing? Just as we in our humanness just have limited capacity because we're dealing with our own stuff and we can't really come alongside somebody else who's got long-term needs, and lots of questions for me around that.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a kind of a silly fun show a while back called Lie to Me.
Hmm.
And the premise was there was a group led by this one person who could tell when someone was lying, could tell when they were doubtful, when they were of their own answer. They could tell all these things just by the micro-iniquities, the body language
Mm.
of people, the smiles and the eyes and all the stuffs. And it was interesting show. And he'd solve things
Okay.
with this skill. His premise was that it was very non-people group, very non, it was around the world.
Mm.
Everybody exhibited those same things. Now, you may avert your eyes in some cultures versus look someone in the eye like, but that didn't matter. Those things about when you're telling a lie, when you're not sure of yourself, when you're happy, when you're joyful, those expressions were around the world.
Mm.
And it was interesting because he would show somebody who was exhibiting shame, for instance, and then they would flash up one, two, three pictures of people in out of history who have had shame from around the world,
Mm.
right? And it was very interesting. So anyway, that premise of that and it's just a TV show, is that it's very non-people group and that people expressed themselves all the same. But I think what you're saying is we as at least in our experience, we as Americans tend to try to get through things
Yeah.
and try to shove feelings and try to be done with things and try to move on and try to say, hey, I'm kind of at my limit with my own self. There's only
Mhm.
so much I can help you out with.
Yeah.
Might be more of an American United States condition.
Yeah, perhaps. But I really was thinking about this morning in the way that I react to others that are in chronic pain, for example. For somebody who has a condition where they're not getting better anytime soon. And how do I walk with them through that as a friend, as just somebody who loves and cares about them, or somebody who has been in depression for a long time, right? I know enough about myself as I'm very empathetic and I can get very quickly sucked into other people's sadness and other people's pain. And so I do have to watch a little bit about how deep I'm going to let myself go. But have I allowed self-preservation to take too much of a place in my heart, in my mind, and in my spirit as I interact with people who need long-term support? So I'm finding myself very curious around this topic in general, and I want to be more reflective in the future when somebody's coming to me with a problem, somebody's coming to me with pain, or is in a period of grief for me to have just that mental cue, like, okay, are you trying to rush this? Are you actually walking in pain with them and in suffering and sorrow and grief with them in the appropriate way?
So let's start thinking about the curious questions here, and starting with ourselves. Am I leaving enough margin in my life to be able to respond with quality time
Mm,
to someone who ends up being in a place of grieving in my life?
mm,
And that can be grieving the loss of a spouse through death, all the way through losing a boyfriend or
yeah, losing a job.
losing a job, losing an election,
Hmm.
which is, way outside of our control, right? So, um, and do I have enough margin in my life to be able to just sit Shiva with somebody,
Hmm.
to be able to be with someone for a couple of hours?
Hmm.
I think is a good one. Um, Another one is uh, how much time do I want to intentionally give
Yeah,
to someone? And I think that has a lot to do with where they are in our circles, right?
sure.
So starting with family and then extended family and then friends and then community and
Yeah.
extended community, et cetera, and workplace
Mm,
environment. I ran into somebody this week in the workplace that just needed to talk and process about the results of the election.
mhm,
I'm in the renewable business, and this person thought that there was going to be a huge impact,
mhm,
right? And was really curious about, curious or anxious, I'm not
yeah,
sure the right word there, about what was going to be, outcomes and consequences
yeah,
of saying. And so, you know, I felt like I needed to, at that point, I guess my logical reference was, we're not going to get anything done in this meeting anyway until this person
mm,
is undistracted by this. And so I kind of let them process and help them talk through a little bit
mm,
and et cetera, and found myself doing that. How much time do we need to give to that?
sure,
What's the appropriate amount of time? Is it as long as they need, or is there an appropriate time to shut it off? Is there and do we have the time to give? Back to the margin question.
yeah. Well, and I think also, I may have already said this out loud, but am I trying to rush the process, either for
Mhm.
myself or
Right.
for someone else? And if there's an inkling of yes, I think that's a good opportunity to step back and really evaluate. Am I rushing it because I don't want to feel, or I don't want the I don't know, I don't want the burden of feeling somebody else's grief because of my own circumstance. And I think there's a whole slew of questions that we can ask internally around that as well.
I had a real sense when I had my initial cancer diagnosis, and it looked pretty bad, that there was some folks who just couldn't deal with that. It
Mhm,
was just like it would be looking their own death in the mirror, so to speak,
mhm.
and just were not capable, didn't have the capacity to deal with that.
Sure.
I could tell, and it made some folks very uncomfortable. And it's like, okay, if I discern that, I needed to make sure that they weren't exposed to that as much as I was in my power, right?
Mhm.
So anyway, these are very good, curious questions. I think, understanding the stages of grief, understanding that many people around you are in some kind of level of grief,
Yes.
and some stage of grief is probably a good thing to have as an awareness.
Mhm.
I think it's okay to ask people, are you okay? Are you grieving a loss right now? Are you, is there something I can do for you? Have you identified anything that can help
Mm.
at this point? You know, can I be involved? Should I be involved? I think those conversations are okay to have as long as you're equipped and comfortable having those conversations.
Yeah, and I think one more kind of subtopic or subgenre I'll bring up real quickly before we run out of time is, are we trying to inject our own experience of grief to match somebody
Mm,
else's? Because I think
yes.
that is something that we do consciously or subconsciously, I don't know, but somebody has lost a spouse, you say, "Oh, I know exactly how you feel. My dog died last year," or whatever it is, and
Right.
us trying to relate or us trying to express that I know your pain, and the answer is no, you don't.
No, you don't. And a corollary of that is people take their own time to grieve. And so
Yeah.
one person dies, and using death as the example here because it's one of the most extreme parts of grief, the people around them will grieve at different times.
Yes.
And I find myself thinking, oh, that person is grieving too long, or that person's grieving too short.
Hmm.
Care, aren't you? You should be grieving longer.
Yeah.
Or wait a minute, okay, you've had enough time.
Yeah.
I'm over it, and I was closer to that person, right? Those those statements out loud, are I mean, you're trying to be objective here, but there's no objectivity to
Yeah.
grief. It's all very subjective,
For sure.
and different people grieve differently, and it takes some people longer by nature, and it takes some people less time, and the way it looks during that time is different.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I appreciate you kind of processing this with me. It was just one of those very real conversations that I found myself in this morning that's kind of sent me thinking down a lot of different trails in my own life and how people have responded to me, how I respond to others. And I thought this might be a helpful conversation for our general audience, just as we are trying to do relationship better. And inevitably, as human beings, we are going to encounter grief. And so how we deal with it personally and how we deal with it in relation to those in our lives, I think really do need some curiosity.
Yeah. And I'll close with this. Don't do it alone.
Mm,
And don't be concerned or judgmental about who might help you.
mm,
Um, this is not the time for isolation, and it's not the time to say, you know what, this person maybe irritates me or gets on my nerves, so they can't possibly help me,
mm.
because it's not true.
Yeah, you
I
never
can
know.
tell you from my own experience.
I'll say, speaking of a little annoying character, there's a video going around on social media, Andrew Garfield on Sesame Street, and he's having a conversation with Elmo. So Andrew Garfield lost his mother, I don't know how long it's been now, maybe 18 months, 2 years ago, and he's having a conversation with Elmo about grief. That's a sweet little video if you want to look it up, and talking about never knowing where help might come from in the process
Mhm. Mhm.
of hearing a voice that might resonate and speak some gentle words into you. That might be worth looking up.
Absolutely. Good.
Okay. Well, thank you. We will wish you all a great week ahead. And if it's not a great week, and if you find yourself in grief, we do want to encourage you to ask some curious questions around it. about how you're processing and who you might need to pull into the equation. So we will catch up with you again next week here on Curiosity, Not Judgment. Thank you for your time.
Take care.